Tonight, we're going to be digging into one of the topics that has been on everyone's mind lately, particularly those with an international relations lens, which is how is all of this global chaos being caused by the coronavirus pandemic going to impact the international system, the relations among the major powers, and so forth going forward. Our guest tonight is Stephen Walt, who is the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School. He's the author of a number of major books on U.S. foreign policy and international security, including 2018's The Hell of Good Intentions, America's Foreign Policy Elite and the Decline of U.S. Primacy, and one of my favorites from a few years before that, The Origins of Alliances. He's also a columnist at Foreign Policy, where he's had several recent pieces on international relations under the shadow of the coronavirus. So welcome to the society, to the Society's digital discussion, Dr. Walt.
Nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely, absolutely. So to start off, there's been a narrative in the kind of post-Cold War era that we would see this rise in non-state actors as key players in the international system. NGOs, terrorist groups, social movements, businesses, that these might end up supplanting, displacing states as the main actors on the international stage. Has the coronavirus crisis, as a major test of that international system, borne that out?
Well, no, it's probably what you'd expect me to say. I mean, I don't think any of those other actors had supplanted the territorial state or the nation state even before the coronavirus hit, which is not to say that NGOs and international organizations and lots of other non-state actors don't have a role to play. But I think the big events of world politics and the way in which most human beings live is shaped primarily by what states do or what they don't do. And decisions being taken at the national level really are much more significant. Now, in terms of the pandemic, I mean, one of the things you see is whenever anything really bad happens, most people turn to their own governments to try and deal with it. You know, after 9/11, Americans didn't call up Microsoft and say, we want, Bill Gates to solve this problem. They didn't call up the MacArthur Foundation and say, please deal with Al-Qaeda for us. They expected the federal government to do that. And we're seeing exactly the same thing happen with coronavirus, not just here in the United States, but around the world. That people in countries are looking to their own governments to deal with this. Mostly it's been independent national action. And that's been in some cases quite effective, in other cases not so effective. But I think this event is not doing anything to undermine the central importance of the state. You could even make the argument that the role of the state has increased enormously in the last 6 months or so, precisely because of the need to try and coordinate action, to prop up economies, to monitor what people are doing. This is, whether you think that's a good thing or not is separate. But the state's not going away. If anything, it may be more important now and in the immediate future than it was in the recent past.
Yeah, and just to dig in a little deeper on the questions around the state in this crisis, the more structural schools of realism have tended to downplay the idea that different types of government will respond to crises differently. Do you think that matches up with some of the events that we've seen in the coronavirus crisis response by different governments?
That's a great question. I mean, certainly, structural realism doesn't pay a lot of attention to so-called unit-level characteristics and tends to treat at least all the major powers as more or less the same. Now, that's not to say that realists don't understand that there are differences between democracies, dictatorships, different kinds of governments. It's worth remembering that Ken Walt wrote an entire book comparing the parliamentary system in Great Britain with the presidential system in the United States and what the implications were for foreign policy. So even Ken Waltz understood that domestic factors mattered. But certainly that's not sort of central to structural realism. I think if you look at the response to coronavirus, what's interesting is there doesn't seem to be a clear pattern. You've got some dictatorships that seem to be responding actually pretty effectively. Even in the case of China, which clearly blew it at the beginning of the crisis, then seemed to have gotten its act together and dealt with it relatively effectively. Some other authoritarian states have done pretty well. Some democracies, Denmark comes to mind, New Zealand, Australia, all seem to have responded quite effectively to this. Some other democracies, and I regret to say the United States is among them, have not done particularly well. So up till now, I don't think we're seeing a significant difference in effectiveness of response that you could relate to regime type. There doesn't seem to be a clear pattern yet, at least, in who's going to respond to this most effectively. I guess the only other thing I would add to this is thus far, we're seeing almost every government move in a somewhat more authoritarian direction, by which I mean these are governments, as I said before, taking over more authority, more control over people's lives, telling people to stay home, shutting down businesses, saying you can't go outside without a mask, beginning to do various types of contact tracing, maybe using other forms of surveillance to keep track of where people are going. And I think one really interesting question as we think about the future is which of these governments are going to then relax a lot of those controls, give up those powers as quickly as they can, and which governments are going to decide they actually kind of like having that level of control over their citizens and aren't going to want to relax them in the future. I think there we're going to see significant variation across different societies, including across some different democracies, I suspect.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been some interesting cases of policy stickiness and policy transfer. In Israel, the use of terrorism, originally counterterrorism methods, to then begin contact tracing by monitoring people's phones, for example. I mean, it's been really interesting to see how some of these policy tools get adjusted.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a basic lesson here, right? When people are really scared, their willingness to put up with things they would not otherwise put up with goes way up. It's true in wartime. It's true in any other kind of national emergency. And we're seeing it with this crisis as well. You get people sufficiently worried about their own safety. They're certainly willing to tolerate a level of government interference, a level of government control that they otherwise might rebel against, or at least object to very strongly.
Yeah. Well, and going up to the international level, how much international cooperation have we really seen against the virus issue, and how much should we have expected to have seen? There's been several high-profile failures of cooperation or failures of institutions fairly early on in the crisis. That Italy requested help from the EU and got fairly limited help through that channel, with the Czech Republic allegedly actually stealing or diverting a shipment of personal protective equipment that was headed to Italy. The United States diverted masks that were intended for the German police, which the Germans called piracy. And China allegedly has withheld key information about the virus as it has been emerging. What do you make of this situation through that cooperation?
Well, I'm not really happy about it, but I'm also not very surprised by it. I mean, again, a realist perspective would tell you that yes, states do cooperate, but ultimately at the end of the day, they think for themselves, or they tend to be selfish rather than thinking for others. So we have certainly seen examples of cooperation, of generous acts being taken for one reason or another by countries to aid those that need more. But by and large, I think the overall direction has been kind of every country for itself. Certainly the examples you presented are consistent with that. Another good example is the fact that, the Trump administration has announced what it calls Operation Warp Speed, which is supposed to be an accelerated effort to develop a vaccine. Well, one of the explicit requirements in that operation is that there be no cooperation with China. And a number of epidemiologists and immunologists have criticized this by saying, look, if you're trying to get a vaccine as quickly as possible and important scientific breakthroughs are being conducted someplace else, you'd want to know about them. So to exclude a country entirely from it might actually be quite short-sighted. The one final thing I will mention, though, is the place I think where you've seen the greatest level of cooperation has been, not surprisingly, within the scientific community itself. Has a long tradition of transnational collaboration. Science is really a global phenomenon. People do exchange lots of information as a matter of course. There's lots of collaborations that go across international boundaries. And at a moment when we're facing a genuinely global crisis, you do see actually lots of scientists sharing data, sharing information, and hoping that somebody comes up with a series of therapies or a set of workable vaccines that can get us beyond this, sort of what we're all hoping for as rapidly as possible. I think that's the area where we've seen the most cooperation. Actual state-to-state collaboration has been, as usual, somewhat fragile and subject to various geopolitical concerns and just, general national selfishness as well.
Kind of tying into that, what does this mean for globalization then? If you have, for instance, the scientific community collaborating fairly well, states not doing such a good job, these global supply chains that have developed over recent years under increasing strain, what's the impact there?
I think there it's pretty clear that, COVID-19 is going to accelerate a set of processes that were already underway. I mean, we were seeing something of a backlash against globalization long before the pandemic began. Gradual decoupling of the U.S. and Chinese economies, events like the Brexit decision in Great Britain, the trade wars that the Trump administration had started or at least flirted with a number of other countries, and a general popular backlash against it in a number of places as well. I might add that had really at least two dimensions. One was concerns that opening up the entire world economy and sort of going to a sort of hyper-globalization level of trade and investment was having negative effects for some sectors of society. That provoked a backlash. And also concerns that movement of people had become too easy. And you saw that the opposition in Europe to migration, the impulse to build a wall here in the United States. So there was a lot of this happening even before the pandemic began. Of course, the pandemic is just going to accelerate this. First of all, it's exposed the economic fragility of all of these supply chains that were put together purely for reasons of economic efficiency, sort of the cheapest way to make your iPhone, the cheapest way to do anything else was to have these complicated supply chains and go to the cheapest source you could get. Well, people are now discovering that has a downside. If anything disrupts that, the economic consequences are quite severe. And that's especially acute if it's medical supplies, drugs, medicines, things like that. So I think you're going to see that trend accelerating. Not to the point of autarky, not to the point of rampant protectionism, but a retreat from the levels of globalization we saw 5 years ago. And the same thing will happen with respect to people. We're discovering that allowing people to move pretty freely around the world with very little monitoring, except maybe a passport, has a downside to it when a pandemic shows up. So I think you're going to see various measures taken to at least monitor that or restrict it or limit it. And in some cases, it will also be exploited by people who are, anti-migration, anti-immigration, anti-refugee, and this will be used as a pretext to raise those walls a little higher. So I guess, I don't think globalization will come to an end. I think the economic consequences of ending global trade would be impossible to fathom and opposed by almost everyone. But we're going to see a step back that was already happening, and COVID is going to accelerate it.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of long trend lines that may be impacted by this crisis, let's talk about China. They've had this growing stature in recent years, but at the same time, there's the virus did originate there. Their initial response to it has come under a lot of criticism. People have grown more wary in some cases of having those supply chains quite as connected to China as they are. At the same time, you see China being able to supply PPE to countries like the case of Italy, which I mentioned earlier, where they didn't really get much help from the EU. They did get a shipment from China pretty quickly after that. How does China come out of this?
I think it's really kind of too early to tell. And one of the things we all should be is a little bit humble about this, because we still don't know how long this is going to last, what the long-term responses are going to be in different societies, whether or not countries that started off responding badly will get their act together, et cetera, what the long-term effects are going to be on different countries. Just to take one example, if we do see a period of partial deglobalization, that's going to be absolutely bad for the United States. Americans are not going to live as well in a less globalized world, at least in the aggregate. But on the other hand, the United States is not going to be harmed by that as much as some other countries that are much more trade dependent than the American economy is. The United States is actually very low in terms of its trade dependence relative to most other countries. So we're going to be absolutely worse off, but we might be relatively better off compared with some others. In the case of the Chinese, I think it depends in part on whether or not they've really been able to lick the virus, get it under control. I think the evidence there is quite ambiguous up until now. I think it will also depend on whether or not their economy, which is somewhat more trade dependent than ours, somewhat more export dependent than ours, can get restarted rapidly. And then finally, it will be, I think, a function of, in a sense, how they handle this diplomatically. They've gotten some criticism from a number of quarters and have not necessarily reacted to it in a way that's going to win them a lot of friends. So there's now an emerging pretty serious dispute between China and Australia after Australia proposed that there be essentially an international panel of scientists to go try and figure out exactly what happened in China so we could learn from this experience. Chinese reacted to this very negatively, started to threaten a trade war against China. It seems to me if the Chinese response to criticism on this is to essentially lash out at others, that's not necessarily going to win them a lot of friends. I might add that that's also true here in the United States. If our response is simply to lash out at China, lash out to other countries, and not to cooperate with them, that's not going to help the American position either.
And so digging into that U.S. case, then, how is this going to impact us? There's already been talk that Pentagon spending, overseas deployments, especially outside East Asia, were going to come down. This was even before the virus. And now the nation's fiscal picture is looking worse, after we've picked up a lot of new debt, really blown out the deficit in order to fight the economic impact of the virus. And there's been this outcry about the lack of preparedness for the pandemic. So are we at a kind of turning point? Are we on the verge of, in the words of Barack Obama, starting to nation build at home rather than overseas?
Yeah, I think this is going to have a series of implications for the United States. First and foremost, this is a real blow, it seems to me, to American prestige. The sort of aura or image that we have of being a highly competent society that knows what it's doing, can handle problems when they arise, technologically sophisticated, all of that stuff. I think that image was already being affected by some previous events, the financial crisis of 2008, the Iraq War, things like that. But this is really not going to help at all. You just sort of have to ask yourself at this point, what countries would want to listen to American advice on how to solve a big social or political problem, given that we've done so badly thus far in dealing with this one. So I think that problem is there, and it worries me a lot. Second, as you suggested, resources are going to be constrained going forward, partly because of the debts we've now taken on to keep the economy afloat, but also because this crisis is going to expose, or has already exposed, some pretty substantial inequities in the United States. I wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago basically saying that, ironically, Bernie Sanders didn't get the Democratic nomination, but Bernie Sanders may turn out to be the big policy winner here. The idea of health care for everybody, Medicare for all, is going to sound very attractive to people in the wake of a pandemic like this. And when you look at how the economic effects of this are hitting lower classes in the United States, according to the Fed chair a couple of weeks ago, 40% of households whose incomes are less than $40,000 a year. So 40% of those households have had someone lose a job in the last couple of months, right? And that suggests that the impact of this, which is going to hit all of us, is really going to hit other Americans, and that's going to be appealing to sort of a Bernie Sanders agenda too. So we could be really surprised, sort of regardless of who ends up winning in November. And then finally, this, I think, cannot help but have impact on our global position in a variety of ways. In my view, we were overextended before the pandemic happened. The gap between resources and commitments is even bigger now. And I think lots of Americans, especially younger Americans, are going to be asking, well, where am I going to get a job? When am I going to be able to visit my parents? When am I going to be able to go to school in person again? And they're not going to be spending as much time asking which corrupt politician is going to be running Kabul in Afghanistan. That's not going to be at the very forefront of many Americans' concerns right now. I think that also means support for the marginal F-35 is going to go down as well. I don't believe that's going to cause, radical disarmament. I don't think the defense budget is going to get cut in half or anything like that. But I do think you're going to see a lot of pressure on things like that. And that's going to require the United States to be substantially more selective in terms of its international commitments. Again, not a retreat to isolationism, but not trying to run the entire world as we've been trying to do for the last 25 years or so.
But at the same time, there are folks who have been pushing in a different direction. Several folks around the administration, close to the administration, like Senator Cotton, have been really amping up a sense of friction with the People's Republic of China. Is there going to be perhaps more of that Cold War narrative with China? Are we bound for greater confrontation given the friction that's been happening around this virus?
Well, the virus is not making things any better. But again, and here's the structural realist in me coming out, right? The United States and China were going to be rivals, even if this event had never happened. The two most powerful countries in the international system are always going to eye each other somewhat warily, are always going to be concerned about what the balance of power and their balance of influence around the world is likely to be. So I and other realists have been predicting that there was going to be sort of significant competition, possibly dangerous competition between the United States and China, again, independent of Corona or anything else like that. I think there's no question that what's happened now is making it worse. In a sense, both sides pointing fingers and accusing the other. In my view, the Trump administration attempting to use Beijing as a scapegoat to distract people from their own failings. And then, of course, as always happens in the United States, some politicians wanting to jump on that and use it for their own purposes as well. So again, I think Sino-American rivalry is sort of baked into the international system, hardwired into the current situation. But that's also going to require the United States to be more selective and more careful. If you're engaged in a serious competition for power and influence with a country as large and as capable as China, you can't be wasting a lot of time, money, attention, and effort on interests and conflicts that don't really matter anymore. So I do think there's going to be a lot more focus on Asia and a lot more focus on China. And if we don't find ways to liquidate or reduce our commitments elsewhere, we're not going to do very well on that, I think, much more important set of concerns, largely focused on Asia. Sorry, I'm not hearing you, John.
Oh, sorry. I was muted there. Let's pivot to some audience questions. For everybody listening, there's two ways that you can ask a question. If you'd like to ask your question on video, you can scroll down to the participant list and click to raise your hand, and we will call on you. Otherwise, you can drop it in the chat box. We've already got one question from Byron in the chat box already. How will COVID-19 affect the idea supply chain as well, the flow of ideas which occurs between domestic and international students on campuses, in labs, et cetera, that will be hampered by this virus? What do you make of that?
That's a great question. And, I base my answer a little bit on the experience I've had the last couple of months teaching online, teaching very much like what we're doing tonight. And in some cases, teaching students who had gone back home. Where I teach at the Kennedy School, about 40% of our students are from overseas. So I had students, zooming in from Ecuador and from China and from Korea and a number of other places to participate in class. Some of that is certainly going to continue, but it's not going to be the same, as those of you who may still be students know even better than I do. And I think what also is going to happen, sort of consistent with what I was saying previously, is some of the barriers to international collaboration in science and other areas of knowledge are going to become more difficult. There's going to be more restrictions placed on sharing information in key areas, or only sharing them with countries that we think we have good relations with. And we saw this, back in the Cold War to some degree. The scientific community tends to resist this, but they can't resist it completely. So I think overall, this is going to have a negative effect on our ability to have the kind of intellectual exchange that many of us find beneficial and often has really powerful both economic and even lifestyle benefits here in the United States.
Let's go to Jeffrey Brown. You've got your hand up.
Sorry, one second. I just wanted to unmute. So I mainly study South Asia, so I want to know what your thoughts are on what Corona might be doing to the Pakistan-India dyad, and also maybe throw China in there, just the South Asia conflict overall. India's kind of Goldilocks dilemma between China and Pakistan it finds itself in.
So I'll start by saying I don't consider myself a regional expert on South Asia, and you may well know much more about this than I do. But I'll say a couple of things. I mean, I do think as a general rule, there will be some exceptions to this, but as a general rule, this is likely to hit the developing world very hard. For all of the obvious reasons, density in urban areas, not as well developed public health systems, just lower levels of medical care, less resources to throw at the problem, and in some cases, some pretty significant economic effects as well. So this is as bad as it's likely to be, for the United States, for Western Europe, Japan, China, et cetera. I think there are many parts of the developing world, and I would include, Pakistan and India there. as that are going to be really adversely affected and in ways that I can't fully anticipate. In terms of the potential for conflict, I wrote a piece in Foreign Policy that went up, I think, earlier today, and I hope I wasn't too optimistic. I was basically suggesting that that I didn't think this was going to make war more likely. I mean, you can tell a story, it's pretty familiar in the IR theory literature, about how some leaders might decide this is a good time to go to war, either to distract people from their own failings at home or because they think maybe an adversary might be vulnerable. The problem with those arguments in this context is that this is hitting everybody adversely. Almost every society is being hurt by this. It's not like some are becoming stronger and others are becoming weaker and therefore vulnerable. And it's also a period where you kind of don't want to be fighting wars, because wars involve, by their very nature, bringing lots of people close together on a battlefield, at a military base, at a training center as well. Look at the problems we've had with the crews of some of our warships around the world. So starting a big war when you've got a contagious disease all over the place is just not a really smart idea. And I hope that lesson is borne in on leaders in a variety of different places. And then finally, to the extent that this is an economic disaster, or at least a huge problem for different governments, again, that to me is going to be a disincentive for conflict of any serious kind. Populations around the world are going to be more interested in whether the government is helping make people safe, helping people become healthier, and getting their economies restarted. And going to war is going to be a waste of resources at a moment when there's lots of domestic needs that are going to have to be met in lots of these places. So if there is a silver lining in all of this, it's that, in fact, this may be a period where the incentive for conflict goes down. You might see as a supporting example the fact that Saudi Arabia has suddenly gotten interested in maybe having a ceasefire in the Yemen war as well, recognizing that maybe this isn't the best time to be fighting in Yemen, something they hadn't recognized until this hit. Now, one final thing, I can't rule out stupidity, right? Very important cause of war. And so it's possible you'll see someone foolishly decide that now's the perfect opportunity to do something. But I'm going to hope that I'm right on this one, because we could use something to be a little bit optimistic about these days.
All right, next question goes to Dan Zhukov.
Dr. Walt, actually echoing what you've just said about the likelihood of war not being really high, but also echoing your statement about COVID-19 creating sort of a wartime feeling for people being willing to tolerate more things. What are your thoughts on the pretty extensive use of war metaphors when discussing the outbreak? And what effect do you think that type of rhetoric might have on policy decisions?
I'm not going to be able to give you a very good, sort of social scientific, based on lots of research kind of answer there. I'll just, I guess, express my basic prejudice that we overuse the war metaphor. We have a war on drugs, we have a war on poverty, we have a war on almost anything that we decide needs to be a big organized campaign. And I think that kind of language isn't really necessary. We recognize that there are people who are performing heroically, that are making enormous sacrifices for all of us. We recognize that almost all of us are going to have to make adjustments and sacrifices in how we live our lives for some extended period of time. But I don't think that has to necessarily be related to a military campaign with the sort of usual martial rhetoric, martial language, et cetera. I think you can get people to make sacrifices without immediately tying it to those sets of images as well. I think that in some respects it's just a distraction.
Thanks so much.
Next up, Ines Sain.
Hello, Professor. My question has to do with post-virus China-U.S. relations. So I read a couple of articles in respectable platform that started using language that's usually reserved for a country like Iran with China, that it became kind of a, in a way, rogue nation because of how it dealt with the virus situation. It didn't let the world know China is the main actor responsible for. So there's this kind of discourse brewing around kind of a group of people want America to reevaluate its relation with China and make it in a kind of more adversarial way. So when we say China is a peer competitor, I think there's a risk that this discourse brews a threat inflation. So I'm curious whether you say that. How would you define China being peer competitor? Is it a threat on military or economic matters, or is this kind of threat perspective overblown? And do you see China-U.S. cooperation post-virus, the situation of China-U.S. cooperation?
Yeah. So again, I think the United States and China are peer competitors. Peer competitor is actually a pretty mild phrase, right? It's one thing to call a country, a great power rival or a great power competitor or a peer competitor. It's quite something else to call it a rogue nation or an aggressor state or a lawless regime or whatever you want to say. And I do think words matter. I think rhetoric does make a difference. And that's true for some of the more extreme rhetoric you'll hear coming out of China about the United States as well. So I think that the rivalry between us, as I said before, is pretty much hardwired into the distribution of power in the international system. We're going to be competing for influence in a variety of places. I think mostly that's going to be a competition for influence in Asia. And I would just add as a footnote that I don't think we have been waging that competition very effectively the last few years or so. Having said that, the language we use matters, partly because it affects just how poisonous the relationship is, how intense the competition is. And to me, it always strikes me as dangerous when you see countries, no matter who they are, starting to talk about each other as if they're irrevocably hostile, that there's no possibility of cooperation, no possibility of ever doing business with them in a serious way. They're just unalterably evil. And that's another word, right, that you'll see in more extreme cases. Well, once you start assuming that the other side can't be dealt with at all, what's the only alternative that's left? Right. So, that kind of rhetoric troubles me greatly. It's also dangerous in a different sense. Other countries, third parties, and in particular, countries that we want to remain close to, want to have solid allied relationships with, tend to be very nervous and very worried by whichever major power they see as disturbing the peace. Right. So if the United States behaves too energetically, too aggressively in Asia, this makes Japan nervous, South Korea nervous, Taiwan nervous, the Philippines nervous, even makes India nervous. Right. By contrast, if it's China that is seen as the country that's disturbing the peace, trying to change the status quo, throwing its weight around, being unpredictable, being potentially assertive, et cetera, those countries tend to want to be close to the United States, and they see us as a source of stability. So I think it's actually very bad for the United States to be using really hot language, really extreme rhetoric, partly because it just creates a spiral with China, but also because it makes other countries who we want to remain on good terms with nervous. And then the final point I'd make is, over the next 5, 10, 20, 25 years, the United States and China are going to have to figure out what are the areas in which they have genuine shared interests, right, where they really do need to cooperate with each other, and what are the areas where they recognize their interests are opposed and we're going to be competing. Two obvious examples. The United States and China have a shared interest in making sure we don't make the planet unlivable through climate change. Right. We should be cooperating as much as possible to try and address that because it affects both of us, and there's no way to separate ourselves out from the effects of that as well. Second, we've learned in the last 6 months that we have a shared interest in making sure that when strange diseases migrate from one species to another and start infecting millions of people around the country, around the world, we have a shared interest in being better prepared for that next time it happens, regardless of where it happens and how it comes about. So there's another interest. You could argue that the two countries have a shared interest in making sure that terrorist groups don't get a hold of weapons of mass destruction. That's another area where we ought to be cooperating with China. That leaves, one final thing is, because they're going to be either the world's largest or the world's second largest economy, and we're going to be either number one or number two, we have some interest in making sure that the world economy is managed in a reasonably stable fashion, that we don't have big macroeconomic or financial panics every 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. All right, so those are all areas where we really ought to be talking to the Chinese, not because they're our best friends necessarily, but because we have shared interests. That leaves a very wide array of other areas where we can compete with one another in a variety of different ways. But figuring out what are the areas where we should cooperate and what are the areas where we're going to have a more conflictive relationship is, I think, like the major task of American diplomacy and American foreign policy vis-a-vis China. And by the way, China vis-a-vis the United States. And the thrust of your question, which I agree with completely, is, we're not handling that very well right now.
All right. The next question goes to another person from our Syracuse University chapter, Justin Mitchell.
All right. Good evening, Professor. Thank you. Just like to say I'm a huge fan of your writings. They're fantastic. And I'd just like to say, given how hard Europe has undergone with the virus, particularly with Italy going under first and Spain in second place, and with Russia getting thousands of cases every single day, despite the fact that they were one of the first countries to close down its borders. How do you think that this virus will impact the operations of quote unquote common house Europe and a superpower aspiring Russia?
Well, I don't think Russia actually at this point aspires to be a superpower. And if they do, they're deluding themselves. You can't be a global superpower if you have an economy that's smaller than Italy's. And Russia's economy is smaller than Italy's. They have some other tools, other forms of influence. They are clearly an important regional power, and they have some capacity to shape events in other places. But if their goal is to be a superpower, that's not going to happen. I am worried about Europe, I guess. We've seen some efforts within Europe to come up with a collective response, particularly on the economic side. The responses to the virus itself have been mostly national, as has been true around the world. The European Central Bank did a variety of things, and a court in Germany a couple of weeks ago made a decision basically, putting a stop to what the European Central Bank was doing, at least in the short term. And we've seen in very much a replay of the Euro crisis of 2009, a sort of Northern Europe versus Southern Europe mentality that, why should we responsible, rich Northern Europeans bail out people in Southern Europe? So I do worry that, we're seeing a further fractioning of the European Union. And, because I think the EU is actually a very useful institution, one that's whose continued existence and reasonably smooth functioning is actually in our interest as well. This worries me greatly.
Yeah, thank you very much.
That actually ties up nicely to a question from Luca in the chat. How will the virus impact this transatlantic relationship? We were famously recently absent from the global vaccine effort conference. There's also been this kind of turn inward among the EU member states. What impact do you see this having on the future of the relationship, in particular in
I think in the short term, a lot is going to depend on what happens in November here in the United States. I think if you get a Joe Biden presidency, you're going to see at least an attempt let's call it a restoration. Let's try to turn the clock back as much as we can to sort of the way things were in 2015, 2016. Not everywhere, but on a lot of different issues. And that'll be especially true, it seems to me, with the transatlantic relationship. His close foreign policy team is very committed to that set of ideas. So I think you'll see that. I also think that's going to be an uphill fight. And that's not to say that you're going to see a complete rupture in that relationship. But I think given the challenges the United States is going to face with China, given the consequences of the pandemic and the costs, the difficulty of getting the American economy restarted again as well, there's just not going to be a lot of bandwidth and not a lot of resources devoted to maintaining the transatlantic relationship. The one area that, I think is an interesting question, and I've gone back and forth myself over the years on this one, is if I'm correct and the principal axis of world politics is going to be between the United States and China, then where does Europe line up? All right, is Europe neutral? Is Europe on the American side? Is Europe divided, with some countries in Europe sort of leaning towards China, other countries in Europe leaning towards the United States? I used to think that Europe would end up being neutral. They would just simply stay out of this one. I'm not as convinced of that anymore. What I do think is true is that the United States is not likely to remain tightly coupled to Europe in security terms. Committed to defending Europe, committed to being the first line of defense if Europe really has trouble, if the Europeans try to sit out the Sino-American competition. In other words, the Europeans are not going to be able to sort of say, well, if you want to have a rivalry with China over in the Pacific, that's fine. We're not part of that. If they try to say that, Americans are not going to say, oh, well, we'll be happy to help Ukraine. We'll be happy to help defend the Baltic states. We'll be happy to help defend Germany. And you folks don't have to really protect yourselves. I just don't think that's politically workable. But which of those different alternatives is going to play itself out? My crystal ball is not quite that good. I should say that I wrote an article in 1997 suggesting that the transatlantic relationship was going to grow steadily further and further apart and eventually collapse. That was 23 years ago. It hasn't quite happened yet, but I do think the trend line is moving in that direction, and I don't see it reversing in any big and powerful way.
Let's go to another question from the chat. And by the way, I've just dropped some links to our upcoming events in the chat again for folks to register for events in the coming weeks. But Jeffrey has a question about the global oil market and security. If the shale industry, with this huge fall in oil prices, becomes economically no longer viable in the way that it has been, and U.S. production goes down, does the Middle East again become a key geostrategic region in the way that it used to be? And does that change the regional dynamic as well? For instance, the relationship between Israel and the Arab states.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think, maybe in the short term, a little bit, but it's not going to be going back to an era like the 1970s when OPEC really had a lot of leverage as well. I mean, and I say that for several reasons. One is that, yes, the American fracking industry is having hard times now, but some of that capacity can be put back online. So if price gets high enough again, everybody knows that that's what will happen. Some producers will come back in and the price will start going down. Second, we're in this very unusual position, right? We have this enormous oil glut right now, which is partly due to just oversupply, partly due to the economic recession that is now global. But bear in mind, there are several major oil producers who are effectively offline. Venezuela is offline now. Iran is pretty much offline now for political reasons as well. Libya is offline now for political reasons, and Iraq is underproducing for political reasons as well. So there's actually an awful lot of oil and gas out there to be pumped if the political conditions were right. In other words, you have to maintain those political conditions or else you still get more oil coming onto world markets. So I don't, that's a long-winded way of saying I don't see the price going way up anytime soon, which would then turn Middle East oil into something really critical again. And then last but not least, over the medium to longer term, humanity has simply got to stop burning as many fossil fuels anyway. We're going to have to wean ourselves to the extent possible off of those things. And that means the demand globally for oil and gas of all kinds is going to keep going down, which will reduce the strategic importance of the Middle East. And this, by the way, is what the Saudis have figured out. And you don't have to be a big admirer of Mohammed bin Salman, but his attempt, however you feel about the implementation, his attempt to sort of get the Saudi economy to be more diverse is a recognition that they know that by 2050 or 2100, you're not going to be able to run the entire country based on the kind of oil prices that we've had in the past. The world's just not going to be able to tolerate that.
And I think that ties up nicely with a question that I saw in the chat from Rachel Lau, who also has her hand up. Would you like to ask it on video?
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, so I was just in connection to your comments on global cooperation, both by state and non-state actors, and as well as the scientific community. How do you think the coronavirus is going to impact climate change foreign policy, both by the U.S. and other states?
I haven't thought about that at all. I mean, I would like to think that if in fact the scientific community solves this problem for us, if they provide the get out of jail free card, that 18 months from now we've all gotten a vaccine because it was developed through extensive collaboration of scientists. Or we have a set of therapies so that if you do get corona, you can get treated and not have a serious risk of dying. And therefore, students are back on campus and we're all back in restaurants and bars and baseball is happening, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's because people in laboratories, right, figured this problem out and epidemiologists came up with protocols for social distancing and other measures that got us through this whole emergency. That should, in a rational world, elevate the prestige and respect accorded to the science community and do some damage to the credibility of all of the people who have been spreading all sorts of crazy conspiracy theories and questioning all of that. I'd like to think we lived in that kind of a world. And by the way, what would strengthen that is if the countries that come out of this with the least harm are the ones that listened to their scientists, followed the advice, did it quickly, did it energetically. The Australias, New Zealands, Denmarks, Germanys of the world. And if the countries that stuck their heads in the sand, right, end up having a much bigger both death toll, but also economic price to pay, maybe that lesson will sink in a few brains as well. So again, in a rational world, that's what I would hope for. The problem is I've spent the last few years becoming more and more convinced that a lot of people are not very rational. And the information environment we all live in now is really conducive to a certain amount of mental pollution. And that's not helping either.
All right, so we've only got a few more minutes left, so I'm going to get the last three video questions that we have here from the folks that had their hands raised. So first off, Christopher, if you could ask your question, and then we'll get the next two in quick order.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you, Professor Walt, Mr. Gay, and the John Quincy Adams Society for hosting this. My question is around something you mentioned earlier around Australia kind of calling for this inquiry into the origins of the disease, which is quite bold with their biggest trading partner. My question is around kind of the role of the middle powers. It kind of reminds me of the non-alignment movement during the Cold War, where you had these group of kind of meddling powers that came together for a couple of nice conferences as in juxtaposition against, aligning on the Soviet Union or the U.S. But with the U.S. kind of turning inward and China really on the defensive, I want to see your take on kind of cooperation within the middle power and if there's any legs there.
There are going to be some legs there. I mean, look, if everybody's worried about China and the United States is having a sort of, a senior moment, if you will, right now, then it's not surprising to me that you're seeing some other countries try and step up in various ways. But I also think that, Australia, Canada, some of the other countries you might point to just don't have the same weight to bring to bear, are going to be somewhat more vulnerable to pressure of various kinds. You used the example of the non-aligned movement in the 50s, 60s. The non-aligned movement was ultimately not very effective at advancing its own agenda. Because it was a large group, but a large group of countries that weren't particularly wealthy or powerful, and were sort of easily divided as well. So I think if you have a world where the major powers are misbehaving in one form or another, that's still going to have a greater impact on what any of these other countries are able to do.
And let's just the last two questions here. First off, from Solomon at University of Massachusetts.
Hi, thank you so much for hosting this panel. I was reading in the Washington Post this morning about an upcoming proposal from Bernie Sanders and Ilhan Omar, which is backed by, I think, like 500 or something global lawmakers. And it refers to an initiative to ask international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic to consider canceling debt of smaller developing countries. That's something personally I think makes a lot of sense, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts off the top of your head on that and if there are any unintended consequences that might come as a result of that.
And let's just get the last question here from Scott, who's the editor of our publication, Realist Review.
Thanks, John. Professor, thanks so much for doing this. Over the past few months, even before the virus, I've been getting interested in a really weird phenomenon that was highlighted actually in an article from, I think, Bloomberg a couple years ago, in how there's this odd phenomenon that non-state actors, particularly terrorist groups and criminal groups, tend to govern better than governments themselves. And since the virus started, we've seen this highlighted in a number of different ways, one of which about, say, 3 or 4 weeks ago, there was an article I read about gangs in the favelas in Rio in Brazil, instituting lockdowns, offering face masks and hand sanitizer while the Bolsonaro government is largely sitting on its hands. And so I don't have any specific question, I guess, but I was wondering if you have any thoughts on this notion of non-state actors governing better than governments themselves and how the coronavirus crisis might guide the trajectory of this phenomenon.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. Let me take the first one on the World Bank and Sanders Omar proposal. The first caveat is I am not a development economist and I'm not an international economist, and I try not to stray too far into areas that I don't understand very well. But I think it's highly likely that there's going to have to be some debt forgiveness in some form for countries that, who kind of, borrowed the money under one set of circumstances and then got hit by the coronavirus truck, right? It's not that they were misbehaving. It's not that they screwed up their economies on their own. This just nailed them, right? A problem beyond their control, if you will. Now, whether or not that form of forgiveness takes the form of the World Bank forgiving loans that they have extended, whether that involves private capital who have lent money for a variety of reasons and are going to have to take what's called a haircut in what they get paid back, et cetera. I don't know. And I'm not enough of an economist to know. The thing that everyone worries about in circumstances like that is essentially the moral hazard problem, right? If somebody owes you money and you forgive it, are you encouraging profligate behavior or irresponsible behavior? You really ought to make people suffer so that they don't do this again. But this seems to me doesn't seem to be a case where that's likely to be true in many circumstances. Again, it's not like we're rewarding bad behavior here. We're trying to compensate people for a disaster that they didn't cause. And I think in terms of the World Bank, by the way, I don't know the details of the Sanders proposal at all. But in terms of the World Bank, the big question will be, what's a given country's plan for restoring economic health if we forgive this loan or if we alter the terms so they have an extra 20 years to pay it off or whatever. Do they then have a reasonable plan for getting out of whatever hole they are currently in, assuming that economic conditions around the world improve? As for the second question, I've read a couple of those similar stories about, isolated places. And I think that this is not all that surprising. It's even not that new a phenomenon, that there are a variety of places around the world where criminal organizations have basically taken over certain governance tasks, usually when the central government, public institutions have failed very badly. And that's, there have been problems with governance, say in Rio de Janeiro for a long time, which is why the favelas are there in the first place. And the Bolsonaro government, is certainly, competing for the title of least effective response to a pandemic in the world. It's not a clear winner yet. There are other rivals for that dubious title, but they've done a pretty impressive job there. So it doesn't surprise me that you see some of these organizations, out of their own self-interest in some respects, trying to impose some order and trying to provide, some kind of more effective response to it as well. I think, if there's to maybe end this all off, and it gets back to the question about sort of the scientific community and climate change and all of that. I mean, I do think the other lesson that is going to be driven home by this, at least I hope it is that having effective public institutions is a really good thing. Effective public institutions doesn't necessarily mean a huge, large bureaucratic state. But having people who know their jobs, who know what to do, who have prepared for various contingencies, who have a certain sense of public duty, et cetera, who are willing to speak to their fellow citizens with a certain degree of expertise and honesty, these turn out to be really nice qualities to have in a government. And in the absence of those qualities, you can find yourself in all sorts of trouble. And if that's the lesson that we take from all of this, whether we're talking about national security policy or healthcare or disaster preparedness or taxes, that wouldn't be a bad lesson to learn either.
All right. Well, with that, thank you very much, Professor Walt, for coming on. This has been another digital discussion with the John Quincy Adams Society.